It's quite easy to sympathize with Helga after you realize how messed up her childhood was. She was really abrasive and even a bit of a bully in Hey Arnold. But can you blame her? I mean, her mother was obviously an alcoholic, and she couldn't even count on her father to call her by the right name. Hey Arnold was an amazing show that taught a lot of deep and meaningful lessons in a way that was easy for children to understand, but even as adults, you'll catch something that blows your mind or even makes you cry. And today, that happens to be Helga's childhood and how her entire personality was shaped by a level of neglect that no child should be forced to endure. There aren't any characters from the early Nickelodeon days that could match up to Helga's level of toughness, but that's because she grew up in an environment that forced her to build up that hard outer shell. She grew up in Hillwood, Washington, which was a fictional city created for the show but resembles a lot of compact inner city settings. And just by looking at the streets and the people walking around in the show's background, it wasn't the safest city for a kid to be growing up in. Helga had to quickly learn to not be bothered by trash-filled alleys, and it became normal for her to walk by homeless people on the street. But what made Helga different from all of the other kids around her who grew up experiencing the same thing as her was the fact that Helga was all alone. She didn't have anyone protecting her or making her feel safe, and that's solely her parents' fault. They neglected their daughter so much that she had to build up this strong persona so that she could simply get through her day-to-day life. But what was it about Helga's parents that made them seem so neglectful? Well, when it came to the relationship between Helga and her parents, they were clearly disconnected from each other, and that's entirely Bob and Miriam's fault. And if those names are super familiar to you, it's because that's what Helga called them. That's right, not mom or dad. It was always Bob or Miriam. And on the surface, that might seem disrespectful on Helga's end, but when you look at the way they acted as parents, do you really think they deserve the titles of mom and dad in the first place? When it came to her dad, Robert Big Bob Pataki, he was a neglectful middle-aged beeper salesman who only ever cared about his eldest daughter's success. Throughout the series, he constantly overlooked Helga and often rarely ever noticed her existence. Honestly, the only time he was shown to be interested in what Helga was doing was during the episode Spelling Bee. In that episode, he paid much more attention to Helga than usual because he thought that she could win the competition much like her older sister Olga did on multiple occasions. And if there's a pattern to Bob's parenting, it's that he only likes a winner. He praised Olga any chance he got and held her on a super high pedestal because she was a winner and a prodigy. Helga, on the other hand, got nothing but neglect from him. And Miriam wasn't much better. In fact, most people believe that she was an alcoholic that spent most of her time too drunk to even think about paying attention to Helga. Miriam was always holding a drink that she either referred to as a smoothie or coffee. Sure, Miriam, we'll go with that story. Pair that with the fact that she always seemed to have a hard time staying awake, it's not difficult to see why most people suspected her of putting a bit of an extra kick into her beverages, let's say. These potentially poor habits led Miriam to be just as neglectful as Big Bobby was. And much like Bob's disconnected relationship with Helga, Miriam had a very hard time connecting with her as well. And that's simply because she never tried and she didn't look like a can of coffee. So Helga essentially grew up on her own and had to learn to be tough so that she could effectively take care of herself. Now, you think that it couldn't get any worse than that, right? And yeah, you'd be correct. So thanks for watching, guys.
Of course it gets worse.
Are you kidding me? You should know me by now. It's cartoon corruption. I ruin your childhood TV shows. That's what I'm here for. Well, it turns out that Helga's parents were so neglectful that her age became a running joke on the show, which was funny for viewers at home, but looking at it through the lens of a kid, it's actually really devastating. On multiple occasions throughout the series, both Big Bob and Miriam misremembered their daughter's age. And it wasn't like they were close or anything. Like, if they had just been a year off, you could argue, okay, time flies and they just lost track of it. But no, it becomes pure neglect when you realize that Helga's parents thought she was still their little girl, when in reality she was 10 at the start of the show and 11 by the time it was over. Now, 10 and 11 are still young for a kid, but not nearly as young as her parents thought she was. For instance, in the episode Quantity Time, it appeared that Big Bob still thought that his daughter was between the ages of 5 and 7, which means that he had completely ignored at least 3 years of Helga's life. But much like the rest of the lackluster moments between Bob and Helga, they just laughed it off as a joke when Helga flatly corrected him. And again, Miriam wasn't much better. In the episode Beeper Queen, she thought her daughter was 8, which is still 2 years off. but at least when she was corrected, she looked like she felt bad, and she should have. It's bad enough to forget your child's age, but to have neglected them so much that you miss years of their life is just insane to me, especially when you consider the idea that Miriam was neglecting her kid because she was too sauced up from her so-called smoothies. No matter how you slice it, Helga was more neglected than that Tupperware with gross leftovers that's been sitting in the back of your fridge for weeks. I mean, do you think that Helga would have received more attention if she was an only child? Let me know in the comments. It also couldn't have been easy for Helga to live in the shadow of an all-around prodigy. Prodigy? Where? I meant all-around prodigy. You know what? In fact, I think I would have been neglected by Bob and Miriam because I would have bombed on that spelling bee. Nevertheless, in all seriousness, it's not Olga's fault that she excelled in seemingly everything she tried to do. Their parents should have spent just as much time supporting Helga as they did appreciating her older sister. And they treated Olga like she was gold, constantly bringing up her spelling bee trophies and the fact that she was a concert pianist. And while that's super impressive, it still doesn't explain her parents treating Olga as though she was more important than Helga. And then there's me, who can't do either. When the show started out, Olga was about 11 or 12 years older than Helga, and as much as she tried to be a good sister, she and Helga just couldn't really relate to one another in the series. All of the special treatment that Olga received caused a fracture in their relationship and led Helga to resent her older sister. One of the most notable moments where Big Bob and Miriam were shown literally ignoring Helga to give Olga attention was in the special half-hour episode, Helga on the Couch. In the episode, Helga's school, PS 118, got a new psychologist, Dr. Bliss, and Dr. Bliss took notice of Helga right away. After she saw Helga acting like her typical tough self, Dr. Bliss suggested that she start therapy, and that was when Helga let it all out. She began to discuss her dysfunctional home life with her new therapist, and it became abundantly clear just how much her parents had neglected her. A flashback to Helga's first day of preschool showed the truth about her home life, as a young Helga walked up to her parents who were listening to Olga play the piano. Dad of the Year contender Bob quickly brushed her off and told her that he would pay attention to her in a minute. She waited patiently for a second before telling him again that they were going to be late, but once again she was just brushed aside. Only this time, Bob called Helga by her sister's name. That was when Helga decided to walk to school by herself. And if that wasn't tragic enough, it was also pouring rain and she didn't even have an umbrella. She did it though. Helga walked to preschool alone without a single person stopping to see if she needed help, all because her parents were too concerned with what her prodigy sister was up to. Helga learned from a very young age that she was going to have to fend for herself, and that meant that she needed to be tough. It also explains why she pushed people around. It's because she needed to assert herself and make sure that her presence was known and recognized. But don't you think that there would be at least one person in her life who wasn't as neglectful as her parents? And while thinking about it, there was one person who was able to bring out the soft side of Helga, and it's likely because he was the only person who seemed to notice her when she was a child in need. And of course I'm talking about Barack Obama. No, it's Arnold, of course. He was her football head, and she was his confusing bully who was sometimes nice to him. And it all goes back to that day when Helga was forced to walk to preschool alone. As Helga walked through the street, not even the adults on the sidewalk seemed to notice her walking in the rain without a coat or umbrella. A passing car even splashed her and covered her with mud. But all of her pain seemed to fade for a moment when she was suddenly under the cover of a random umbrella. Helga looked over to see Arnold, a boy she had never met before, and the very first thing he said to her was, "I like your bow." That moment stuck with Helga for the rest of her life and was clearly the reason why she was so infatuated with him. Arnold became the one person who Helga could rely on to be kind to others. Her parents, on the other hand, were neglectful, and hands down the reason why Helga grew up to be so tough. But what do you kind people of the World Wide Web think? What would have been different about Helga if her parents had not neglected her and just, treated her like they did Olga? Be sure to let me know in the comments below. I look forward to hearing everything you all have to say.